HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Inner Coast, Essays, by Donovan Hohn. Read by Charlie Thurston. We look at the world once in childhood. The rest is memory. Nostos, Louise Glick. Introduction. We are born into stories already in progress. Those our families tell or avoid telling. Those recorded in history books and newspapers, or left out of them. Those encrypted in biomes and geographies, even in our bodies. Every word we read or write carries with it like vestigial mutations in a strand of DNA, or like the isotopes recorded in the ear bone of a fish, or like the chemical signatures preserved in a core sample of glacial ice, the history of its usage. We are surrounded by a multitude of facts whose significance is neither stable nor self-evident. Doubtful certainties, the writer Guy Davenport called such facts. 20 years ago, a job as a magazine fact-checker provided me with an apprenticeship in the methods of nonfiction. It taught me to be scrupulous about the details, to distinguish between credible sources and flimsy ones, to be suspicious of superlatives and round numbers. But it also made me sensitive to what I've come to think of as the registers of facts. The register of childhood memories differs from the register of your recollections of this morning's commute. The register of a text message to a confidant differs from the register of an affidavit. Essays, so long as they register the differences, can admit speculations and fantasies and dreams, which are also facts. Doubtful certainties as real to us as those we can detect with an MRI scan or stub our toes on. Over the years, because I'm the writer in my family of origin, I've received from far-flung relations assorted documents and artifacts, become the curator of a haphazard family archive. Not long ago, moving house, I found a box sent to me by an uncle that I hadn't bothered to open when it arrived. I ripped off the packing tape, and out tumbled envelopes of photographs, newspaper clippings, letters. My uncle, my mother's youngest brother, had salvaged these findings from among his deceased parents' belongings. The photographs, black and white family snapshots mostly, were loose and jumbled, in no particular order. Many of them had been plucked from the weird scrapbooks my grandfather had kept. A colonel in the Army Air Forces who in civilian life had been a jazz trumpeter. In his scrapbooking, my grandfather was more freestyle collage artist than archivist. He'd scissored up photos, glued one atop another, or rayed around them documents he'd also attacked with his scissors. I found a letter dated May 21st, 1944, sent from an Air Force base somewhere in Italy, that my grandfather, between bombing runs, had written to my mother, his firstborn child, on the occasion of her first birthday. He was sorry he couldn't be with her, but promised he'd be home soon. Reading the letter, I couldn't help thinking of stories I'd heard from other sources about my grandfather's temper and the bruises he left on his children. In 1944, thinking of his homecoming, he'd imagined only domestic bliss. When that day rolls around, just you and Mommy and I will be together all by ourselves. And will we ever have fun, he wrote. I'll just tickle you so much you won't have a chance to hide those big pearls of yours. In another envelope, I found a Xeroxed copy of the program, printed in both English and Korean, for a concert the Seoul Symphony Orchestra had performed on April 27, 1958. The evening's program had included a trumpet solo played by my grandfather and a piano duet performed by my mother and her sister, who in April of 1958 would have been 14 and 12, respectively. I'd heard about this duet many times from relations who'd mentioned it to me as evidence of my mother's hidden gifts in former life. Although the program didn't specify, I knew from my informants which score they'd chosen to play, Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. With the program were photographs, scissored and still sticky with glue, of the two girls in their matching long skirts and matching ponytails tied back with matching ribbons, seated side by side at the keyboard of a grand piano, while their father in his colonel's uniform looks on. When I was growing up, we had a piano in our living room, a Schaefer and Sons upright. But except when she was teaching us arpeggios and scales, I don't remember ever hearing my mother play. I kept shuffling and came upon a letter she'd written to her parents during her first semester at a woman's college in Milwaukee. My father had recently paid a visit, courting her. She'd met his train, escorted him to his room at the Y. They'd gone for ice cream, caught a showing of Breakfast at Tiffany's, whose star, Audrey Hepburn, my mother in her youth slightly resembled. The film, in her opinion, wasn't too hot. My parents had now been divorced for almost 4 decades, and my mother, age 76, lives alone in a condo complex in exurban Connecticut, where, supported by disability checks, she watches Fox News and types inflamed emails about immigrants. Most of the newspaper clippings in the box my uncle had sent, scissored from papers like the Hastings Daily Tribune and the Council Bluffs Nonpareil motto, "The Key to Southwest Iowa," reported on an epic bike trip my mother had taken at age 21 in 1963, a bike trip I write about in the second-to-last essay collected here. She'd pedaled from Wisconsin to California, from what I've come to think of as the inner coast of the continent to what, in the national mythos, the western geography of the American imagination, has, since 1849, if not before, been its outermost one, the coast of the Pacific. I was born and raised there, in San Francisco, but spent my childhood traveling between those two coasts, between the city by the bay and an old family farm near Lake Michigan where my mother's kin gathered for reunions. By the 1970s, the farm was no longer operational. The family had held on to it as a kind of heritage site to where the increasingly scattered tribe would make pilgrimages, sharing meals of boiled walleye and potato salad, while communing nostalgically with an agrarian past, vestiges of which survived. The place was like a museum of anachronisms. Exhibits included an empty red barn, an outhouse with a splintered door, a hand pump that drew water from a well, glistening helixes of amber flypaper that spiraled from the farmhouse rafters. There were also a few chickens, including one whose beheading I was made to witness as an initiation into the sort of brutal yet valuable knowledge farm life was thought to impart. Headless, the chicken's body ran a single flapping lap around the chopping block, a feat both gruesome and comical. At the edge of the farm was a shallow body of water called Lost Lake, and according to legend, a logger had, one winter, attempted to drive an oxen team across it. Heavy with harvested timber, his wagon had supposedly broken through thin ice, dragging the logger and oxen with it, a fate I compulsively thought about while paddling around with my brother in a dented aluminum canoe. Lost Lake was so shallow you could touch bottom with your paddle, but the bottom was so silty and soft, the paddle blade would sink into it as far as you could plunge it, never touching hard ground. Who knew what was down there? I imagined that if you fell overboard and tried to stand, you'd get sucked into the muck, disappearing like one of those hapless and unlikely prehistoric animals, miniature horses with cloven hooves, saber-toothed tigers that had mistaken the La Brea tar pits for a watering hole, and ended up drowned and entombed, which is perhaps how it had gone for that logger and his oxen. An illustrated encyclopedia of the prehistoric mammals of North America was among my prized possessions, and although I'd never visited them, the La Brea tar pits were a prominent feature on the landscape of my inner life. Not long ago, my mother and her siblings sold off their share of the ancestral farm. They and their offspring, my generation, were too scattered and estranged to carry on with reunions. I do not miss the place, but on my own I've kept returning to the Great Lakes. I began working on the first drafts of the earliest essays this book collects as a graduate student in Ann Arbor. A decade later, after publishing a book and becoming a father, I returned to essay writing and to Michigan, which is where I live now. All coasts are marginal and messy places, which is why people like me are drawn to them, I suspect. Where land and water mingle and meet, so do habitats, biomes, worlds. The heart of the great ocean gyres are biological deserts, but at their edges, where currents collide with coasts, upwelling and downwelling churn up nutrients that fertilize the food chain. In the language of ecology, coasts are biologically productive. Tidal littoral zones teem, so do coastal estuaries, so do the wetlands of riparian floodplains. Underwater, on land, and by air, coasts serve as migration corridors. Animals travel them, and prior to the invention of rail, so did we. which is to say that coasts are culturally as well as biologically productive. Coasts have always been contact zones between here and elsewhere. Etymologically, the word coast derives from the Latin for rib, and in Middle English, butchers could still offer you a coast of lamb, meaning a rack of ribs. A sea coast was the rib cage of the land. In its primary sense, coast still refers to the place where land ends and sea begins. In that sense, all coasts are by definition outer and oceanic ones. The usual term for the edge of a lake or stream is bank or shore. But the maritime geography of the Midwestern interior is a paradox. Michigan is Midwestern. It's also coastal, peninsular, in fact. Its shoreline, as speckled with antique lighthouses as New England's, is longer than California's, Florida's, and that of every other state besides Alaska. Standing on a Midwestern beach, you can watch freighters slide across the horizon. In nautical terms, to coast is to travel by water while keeping the land nearby. And in that sense, you can coast through the heart of North America, circumnavigating all of the states east of the Mississippi without ever laying eyes on the Pacific. These days, the word coastal is as sociological as it is geographic. In phrases like coastal living or coastal elites, the word collapses the West Coast and East into a conjoined seaboard, supposedly inhabited by decadent sophisticates, as if Brooklyn were next door to Berkeley, or Boston in commuting distance of Seattle. Certain Chicagoans or holiday-goers on Michigan's Gold Coast might qualify as coastal in this sense, but not the residents of Gary, or Sandusky, or Milwaukee, or of Dearborn, home to the largest Muslim community in the United States, which is an afternoon's paddle down the Rouge River from Lake Erie, or of Osborne, a neighborhood on the northeast side of Detroit that has become popular with Hmong immigrants from Vietnam. In 1615, Samuel de Champlain followed the Ottawa River deep into the interior. From native informants, he'd heard of a great salt sea to the west, which he took to be the Pacific. Hoping to reach the continent's outermost coast, he instead made it only as far as the eastern shores of Lake Huron. In his journals, he says little about his arrival on August 1st, 1615 at the water's edge. The term he used for the Great Lake, mer douce, or Sweetwater Sea, suggests he may have experienced some confusion. His most recent biographer detects disappointment. Perhaps by the time he arrived, he'd already learned from locals that the Pacific was nowhere nearby. But I like to imagine him on the coast of Lake Huron's Georgian Bay, looking out at the horizon, hoping that China lay on the far side of it, and then kneeling down to take a sip. The water's taste, fresh, not salty, would have been to him at once disillusioning and bewildering, like waking from a dream. I imagine him staggering to his feet, looking around, wondering where he was. In two of the essays this book collects, I quote the pair of questions that Thoreau asked after ascending Mount Katahdin in Maine, questions that were for him inseparable, the answer to the one depending on the answer to the other. Who are we? Where are we? In childhood, when the boundaries between self and world are especially permeable, I think we all ask versions of those questions, but in the first-person singular. Who am I? Where am I? Trying to make sense of the stories, histories, and geographies I happen to have been born into. Following the compass needle of my curiosity over the past 2 decades, I've visited, on foot or in my mind, sites that seem to me magnetic with mystery or meaning. Thanks to accidents of ancestry and biography, many of those sites have clustered along the 2 coasts, outermost and innermost, Pacific and Midwestern, between which my imagination has often traveled. With my brushes and sampling jars, by which I mean my notebook and voice recorder, I've collected evidence, arranging doubtful certainties into essays. Thoreau's questions are still good ones, I think. At a time of bewildering and accelerating changes to habitats and geographies, they continue to invite new answers. What follows are several of mine. Ann Arbor, Michigan, 2019. Snail picking. I was, at age 9, a god of snails. on the quiet San Francisco cul-de-sac where my family lived. Helix aspersa, the brown garden snail, was by far the most plentiful and least evasive wildlife around. Snails plied the long green fins of our neighbor's agapanthus like barges transiting green canals. I'd unglue them from their shiny trails, hold them in midair, and poke their sensitive horns. They'd ripple and recoil. Usually I'd show mercy, restoring them to their universe of leaves, but sometimes I'd hurl them hard against a garage door, where they left ichorous spots. Snails were pests, after all. Other times I'd launch them high above the telephone wires. Diminishing as they rose, they'd hang, suspended for a moment at the apogee of gravity's arc, little spinning cosmonauts, brown specks on a canvas sky. Watching them, I tried to imagine how it might feel, ganglia lit up like filaments, in that last astonished instant before they fell. Did they experience snail terror, snail rapture? Or were they too dumb and dizzy to experience anything at all? Afterward, on the asphalt, the shattered bubbles of their bodies, veiny and blue, reminded me of the skinned testicle I glimpsed while browsing my father's medical books. One day, I filled a half-gallon margarine tub with snails, took them home, and set them on my nightstand. Glowing jars of fireflies were for other children. For me, a tub of snails. They climbed the white translucent walls and clung to the underside of the perforated lid. From my pillow, before turning out my light, I could see their dark forms moving around like thoughts. When I awoke the next morning, the lid was off, and the tub, save for a dozen gray squiggles of turd, was empty. Only after opening the curtains did I spy the slow explosion happening all over my bedroom walls, the small armada, the wakes of light. A Romance of Rust. Inches above the auctioneer, under the humid eaves of an almost empty shed, wasps bounce as if on strings, tending their paper nests. "Folks, I've been doing this for 35 years, the auctioneer barks into his wireless headset. His voice, amplified by two portable speakers, crackles across the afternoon. "First thing I ever auctioned was a bird cage. It sold for $1.25. Bidding went up by a quarter back then." He is a short man with a big gut and a scrunched face, the face of a circus clown without his makeup on. His denim newsboy cap matches his denim suspenders. "God's been good to us so far," he observes, interrupting his banter to gaze anxiously at the horizon to the west. "But I'd better hurry. I want to beat the rain." After one of the longest winters in recent memory, spring has finally arrived in lower Michigan, a fitful, moody spring full of sudden changes. Last night, a thunderstorm scattered hailstones across Washtenaw County. Now the sun is out, steam is rising off the fields of timothy and winter wheat, and the air smells pleasantly of mud. If it does start raining again, Tom Friedlander will likely hold the auctioneer personally responsible. All day Tom has been complaining about this clown's lack of professionalism, his fondness for banter, his ignorance of tools. "He has no idea what he's selling," Tom keeps whispering to me. A real professional, he says, would be done by now. Atop one of 3 hay wagons, a skinny teenage boy with a crew cut stoops to the rusty junk piled at his feet and hoists a bow saw into the air. It is an exquisite specimen, just like the ones I've seen in books. "Lift her up nice and high, Ben," the auctioneer says. Bow saws are shaped like the harps angels play in comic strips. They are both ingenious and primitive, held together by the tension in a twisted loop of rope. "How about a bid 20? The auctioneer chants. "I've got 20. How about a bid 25, 5, 25, 27 and a half, now 30, 30, 30, 30. People have been using versions of the bow saw for hundreds of years, but not until the turn of the 20th century, when motorized jigsaws were rendering them obsolete, did anyone think to salvage them from the scrap heap and preserve them for posterity. For decades, this particular saw was as valuable as it was useful to the farmer who owned it. Then one day the farmer grows too old to farm. His children excavate the moldering contents of his barn, hires an auctioneer. The auctioneer runs advertisements in local papers and an auction exchange, drags the saw out into the sunlight along with the rest of the farmer's belongings, rakes with broken handles, a wall clock made out of a slab of polished wood, nails fused by rust into pointy lumps, and the next thing you know, you could have purchased 10 new saws for what this useless one is selling for. Earlier that morning, while we were inspecting the contents of the hay wagons, an old lady wiggled what looked to be a miniature iron hoe at Tom and asked him what it was. "That's an ash rake," he informed her, "for emptying ashes from a stove." "I don't have a stove," the old lady replied sensibly, "so I don't need it." Like her, most people imagine that the form of a tool is a pure expression of its function, and that its value is a measure of its usefulness. Saws cut, hammers pound. On the antique tool market, however, value is largely aesthetic and symbolic. Hammers do not only pound, saws do not only cut, they also mean. As the bow saw transubstantiates from a piece of junk into a collectible before our eyes, Tom Friedlander listens closely to the ascendant bids, stroking his beard, but stays out of it. Bow saws aren't his thing. Too pricey, too desirable. Ever since bidding began several hours ago, he has kept his head down, except when he wants to catch the auctioneer's eye. To place a bid, he will glance up, nod gravely, and curl his fingers toward his heart, beckoning. So far today, he has purchased a hand-forged chopper, a barn beam auger, 2 antique motor oil bottles with cone-shaped spouts, a box of early automobile starter cranks, a set of speed wrenches, a fence stretcher, something called the Toxo-Wick cattle oiler, and a plastic bucket full of implement wrenches marinating in melted hail. "I've got 50, calls the auctioneer. 55.55, 57.5. If a few years ago you had asked me what I thought of tool collecting, I would have told you that it sounded like the sort of sentimental pastime pursued mainly by men with soft minds, thick wallets, and lonely wives. In New York, where I lived at the time, one sometimes encountered woodworking tools and farming implements on the walls of pastorally themed restaurants serving expensive comfort food, or among handmade quilts and kerosene lanterns in the windows of West Village boutiques. I considered such Americana to be so much nostalgic gimcrack. The inflated prices old tools commanded I attributed to an ambient dissatisfaction with modernity. The more expendable we felt in our jobs, the more complicated and computerized our lives became, the more hardware made of metal and wood seemed to symbolize all that we had lost. We Americans, but especially we American men. Until recently in America, manliness was proportionate to handiness. The ancient Greeks had Achilles and his shield. The British had Arthur and Excalibur. We had John Henry and his hammer, Paul Bunyan and his axe, Queequeg and his manly harpoon. Our national poets sang hymns to the broadaxe and the village blacksmith. Our prophets didn't merely wander in the wilderness. They built cabins there. The adzes and bowsaws with which anxiety-beset urban professionals now equip their apartments originally belonged to self-reliant, self-employed, self-made yeomen and artisans, or so the traffickers in nostalgia wished us to believe. It was a lie, I knew, this Luddite fantasy of an artisanal golden age. That legendary Yankee ingenuity was born not only out of an ardor for craftsmanship and independence, but also out of a shortage of skilled labor and an abundance of cheap, pilfered land. European settlers had picked up many of their tricks, hollowing a canoe with fire, fertilizing corn with fish, from natives whom they repaid with alcohol and infectious disease. And besides, mowing a field of hay by hand was back-breaking work, nothing romantic about it. Homespun textiles required endless, mind-numbing cottage industry. Likewise, the churning of butter, the curing of meat, the hewing of beams and chiseling of mortises. No wonder so many of our agrarian forebears fled to cities at the first chance they got, or else bet the farm on motorized combines and harvesters. I also had personal reasons to be suspicious of tool collecting. Although I come from a family of insufferably handy men able to wire a house, rebuild a transmission, or frame a wall without calling an expert or consulting a book, I am profoundly unhandy. By the traditional measures of American manhood, I am, essentially, a Frenchwoman. When my brother and I were teenagers, he and our father would adjourn to the garage after dinner, hook a cage light to the underside of an elevated hood, and spend hours passing tools back and forth, while upstairs I lay on the couch reading mildly pornographic fantasy novels. To this day, when I do it myself, I can never be sure whether I am improving my home or conducting experiments upon it. One might, therefore, find it strange or worrisome that for a year and a half I've devoted every waking hour I could spare to the study of old tools. I've read books with titles like Wrenches, Antique and Unusual, and The Hammer, the King of Tools. I've stayed up all night browsing the searchable archives of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, encountering there such exotic utensils as the clamp fur knife, which, when Edward Flint of the city, county, and state of New York invented it in 1837, was a new and useful instrument for extracting hairs from fur skins. And I have met a vice president of innovation and design in the cafeteria of the Stanley Works corporate headquarters in New Britain, Connecticut. I've lurked in chat rooms with discussion threads devoted to such subjects as a previously unknown Albert Goodell brace found in the wild. One sweltering summer morning, on the Jay County Fairgrounds in the farming village of Portland, Indiana, I walked among fabulous machines as small as schnauzers and as huge as elephants, all gleaming in the August sun. Drive belts whirred, flywheels revolved, pistons fired, and a forest of smokestacks piped foul smoke and rude music into the otherwise cloudless sky. Mostly, I've ridden a Midwestern circuit of flea markets and farm auctions in the passenger seat of an emerald green Toyota pickup truck, piloted by a 55-year-old botanist with a ponytail, spectacles like window panes, and a beard verging on the Whitman-esque. Tom Friedlander is a tall, faintly melancholy man, prone to long silences and outbursts of goofiness, whom I have always known as Uncle Tom. In 1976, after the botany department of the University of Michigan declined to approve his doctoral dissertation, a taxonomical study of the gray dogwood, for which he had spent the better part of 3 years scouring the continent for specimens, Tom joined his wife Martha, my father's sister, on the faculty of a high school in Ann Arbor. The two have taught biology there ever since. Childless and frugal, by the late 1980s they had saved enough to purchase a ranch house in the rural exurbs, along with the 37 acres of marshy, unprofitable farmland adjoining it, which they subsequently let run wild. For years, Martha had been inviting me to visit this nature sanctuary of theirs. Upon first entering the house, I'd stopped short. Strung on wires and depending from nails hung thousands, or maybe even tens of thousands, of keys. Some strands drooped in elliptical wreaths. Others contorted themselves into asymmetrical Möbius strips and figure eights. The longest strands described arcs across the wallpaper like bunting. The shortest bristled in shiny bouquets. Later, I asked Tom about these peculiar wall hangings. At auctions and flea markets, he explained, dealers sold old tools by the box, and when he returned from his weekend tool hunts, he often found keys buried at the bottom like prizes, so he saved them. People just give them away. Holding a length of keys out for my inspection, he thumbed its tarnished contents. Didn't I see how different they all were? Their lengths and shapes, the words and numbers stamped onto their variegated surfaces? Tom led me down half a flight of stairs to the television den, where a mob of brass hose nozzles had stormed the mantelpiece, and platoons of stoveplate handles flanked the wood-burning stove. Other objects had been mounted according to kind on graying scraps of plywood, which leaned about the room, against bookshelves and corners, like canvases about a painter's studio. There was a board containing silcocks, those spigot handles shaped like cross-sections of bell pepper, some of them red, some blue, some green, some rusty and bare. Other boards contained screwdrivers, locks, shower heads. A few contained rusty things I failed to recognize. A bandolier of belt buckles dangled from a hook originally intended for a houseplant. On an end table beside a row of matching conch shells lay a pair of eggs, fluted geometric oblongs of speckled glass. Electrical insulators, Tom explained, from telephone lines. He referred to these taxonomical arrays of his as experiments. When he retired from teaching, he would make more of them, he said. Many, many more of them. so we could hang them on walls where visitors could see them. An old time.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?